Chapter 14 January 1961 Qinghai-Tibet Plateau. "What has Khrushchev done since Comrade Stalin died?" Commissar Chu bellowed, standing on the stage and sweeping his eyes over the assembly hall. Not even the shuffle of feet disturbed the silence. People kept their focus fixed on his words. Dining halls at the number 221 plant had been converted to assembly venues since the Russians left. The walls now covered with huge cartoons vilifying Soviet leader Khrushchev, sprinkled with quotations from Chairman Mao's speech. "Combat and prevent revisionism." The constant propaganda was designed to make sure the workers, particularly the science personnel, who had close working relations with the Russians, would stand firmly with the Chinese Communist Party. Commissar Chu had already been speaking without any notes for more than an hour. Punctuating his words with an outstretched finger, he continued, "He criticizes Comrade Stalin, a Marxist-Leninist, successor and defender, and then shoves the principles of communism and socialism aside, instead cultivating friendships with American capitalists. He is not a true Marxist, but a modern revisionist, and he has betrayed the spirit of Marxism-Leninism. What's more, he stabbed us in the back by making friends with our enemy India." Both hands punched the air now for emphasis. "We all know what India is doing. They are helping the Dalai Lama to divide China and trying to grab our land by force as well. Russia is no longer our friend, but our enemy. Khrushchev thinks that by pulling out their aid, we will bend to his pressure. But he is wrong. He has miscalculated. We will never get down on our knees. We are building our own road, walking our own path. We are integrating the universal truths of Marxism-Leninism with the concrete practices of the Chinese Revolution. We will show him that we can build a nuclear bomb without him." Before the last ringing word died out, people started chanting the slogans, wave after wave of them, their voices rising with political fervor. Zoe put her hand up mechanically and mouthed the words along with the crowd, but no sound came out. She was beyond tired, exhausted from 18 straight hours at the building site, and after this marathon rally, she still had to finish her self-criticism and hand it in to the special case group by 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. Since the campaign to combat and prevent revisionism started, the party had been busy rooting out traitors and spies. Zoe was labeled a prime suspect, accused of spying for the Russians and stealing materials from the field, and discharged from her position at the testing control center. She felt no regret over her relationship with Igor, even though it had led her straight into another political crisis. She still believed that Igor loved her, that he would have married her if he hadn't been forced to leave. And she told herself they were both victims of Russia's political shift. She hated the Russian government as much as anyone at the number 221 plant, and that hatred helped her forget her own pain. Her self-criticism from yesterday ended with, "Now Russia has taken away blueprints and many other resources. No doubt that loss has slowed down or even temporarily obstructed the progress of our nuclear bomb program. But we have an undefeatable revolutionary will and the people's power. We will produce our own nuclear bombs soon. We will defend our motherland with our own nuclear bomb. We will defeat any invaders. As a scientist, I will not only follow the party's instructions and finish the tasks given to me, but I will also be actively involved in and contribute to the research. I will work around the clock to make up for the time we have lost because of the Russian betrayal. Let us rely on our own strength. We will show the Russian revisionists that they can't bully us, because we will have nuclear devices too, even better than theirs." Yet no matter how hard she tried, her self-criticism had never been fully accepted. The special case group nitpicked over every line, every word. It felt like the crushing humiliation she suffered at Tsinghua University during the Korean War all over again, although she tried to block out that painful memory. Over the past month, she had given up hope of being pardoned and returned to her research, preparing herself instead for a life of physical labor. But 2 days ago, a conversation with Major Leo had ignited hope again. It was a routine confession, this time in Major Leo's office, though she didn't know why. Following the dutiful repetition of her disgraceful relationship with Igor, she examined and criticized herself and her actions. Major Leo had listened without interruption. When she finished, he sat for a long time without saying a word. His silent scrutiny made her very nervous. She began to think it was shaping up to be another disastrous session. To her surprise, though, Major Leo took on a completely new tone, almost tender, like a father comforting his daughter. "As the head of the Special Case Unit, I must always verify any suspicions. I've known you since you arrived here, Comrade Meng, and I believe deep down you are a good person. But you must see your main mistakes. The bad influence of your bourgeois family and your close relationships with both Russian and American men. The verdict of guilty or not guilty depends on your attitude. The more confessions you make, the more thorough your self-reform will be. At number 221 Factory, we have already uncovered 4 hidden Russian spies and counter-revolutionaries, and have to find at least 2 more hidden among us. I hope you won't become one of them." She nodded, wondering silently, why do they have to find another 2 spies? The quota terrified her. She trembled before him, doubting her luck. Major Leo added, as if to alleviate her disbelief, "I'm sure that after going through a thorough process of self-examination and cognition, you will be born a new person with heightened political consciousness. You might even become a party member." Zoe's eyes flew up in astonishment. She was strangely touched by his words. Since the Russians had left, most people had avoided her, as if her political lapses were contagious. She had no friends to turn to, and unburdening her woes to her parents would only cause them grief. Anyway, they could do nothing for her this time. She had to face the humiliation and loneliness on her own. Only at night did she dare let the tears escape, sobbing until she exhausted herself. This was the first time since Igor's departure that anyone had displayed any sympathy. And a party member. She never even dared to dream about that. Her eyes gleamed with tears of gratitude at someone finally showing her some understanding and compassion. His words had flashed through her mind many times since, hoping that it was a subtle signal of possible freedom for her. And now, despite her exhaustion, she wanted to make her self-criticism the best she could and looked forward to reading it to him tomorrow. Perhaps this would be the end of her crisis and a new beginning. The next morning, she stood hesitating outside the general's tower, nervous and shivering in the thin drizzle. Although the air felt cool and fresh, the hand clutching the self-criticism paper in her pocket was hot and sweaty, the pages crumpled between her fingers. Major Leo should be satisfied with my self-criticism this time, she thought. It's much longer and more thorough. Finally, she plucked up enough courage to push the door open and walk in. The special case unit occupied a large meeting room and several small offices at the end of the corridor next to a staircase, where the noise of people going up and down the stairs echoed around. Major Leo stood against a cluster of security officers when Zoe arrived. One of the officers, whose job apparently was to intercept people needing to speak with Major Leo, strode toward her as she walked hesitantly forward. Without a word, he took the paper from her hand and marched back to Major Leo. He returned almost immediately, motioning Zoe into the office. Heart pounding, she obeyed. She sat on a hard wooden chair by the door, taking in the room while she waited. The office was sparsely furnished and simple, like a field commander's office during the war, with only the essentials. A desk against one wall, piled with papers, one chair behind the desk, with another just to the right, and a narrow wooden bed in the corner under a small window. A wisp of smoke curled up from an ashtray. She pinched her nose at its acrid smell. A white coffee mug on the desk, stained a filthy brown inside, made her want to gag. The walls were bare, except for a world map, a picture of Chairman Mao, and a poster of a nuclear bomb just above her head. The poster was a new illustration, one she'd never seen before. She stood up to get a better look and bumped into Major Liu as he came through the door. Embarrassed, she edged back to let him pass, lowering her head in respect. He shut the door behind him, put one hand on her shoulder and laughed. "Are you running away from me?" Zoe guessed he just wanted to put her at her ease, so she forced a smile. Sitting down at his desk, he picked up the cigarette stub and took a long, deep drag on it, his eyes never leaving her. He exhaled, filling the space between them with smoke, and then picked up her self-confession and started to read. As the minutes crawled by, Zoe's heart went faster and faster. Eventually he finished reading, only to drop the paper on the desk, lean back in his chair, and examine her. The intensity of his gaze made her uncomfortable, as if she were naked in front of him. Her fists clenched and unclenched at her sides to hold herself together. She didn't dare ask the question that burned in her mind. Is he satisfied with my self-examination? "Comrade Meng, I will say that your self-criticism is better, more thorough than last time. You've examined your shortcomings and traced them all way back to your ancestors. That's good. However, you apparently still refuse to acknowledge your other fatal mistake, the relationship with Kuzinji." The thought flitted through her mind that he still couldn't be bothered to pronounce Eagle's name properly. She fought the urge to correct him, instead forcing herself to find words that wouldn't offend him. "Our relationship was very pure. I don't see anything wrong in wanting to love and be loved." "But he is a Russian. You know he is a Russian. The Russians are our enemies." "The Russian government is our enemy, but not ordinary Russian people." "He works for an evil government, so of course he is our enemy." "I thought you scientific types were clever enough to realize this basic fact." His arrogant, bullying tone became increasingly more intense, but Zoe controlled the anger that filled her. She couldn't afford to get into a confrontation with him. Desperate to make a good impression so he wouldn't brand her a Russian spy, she said slowly, "I'm sure he does not agree with the new Russian government's policy either." "Why did he leave then?" "I assume he had no choice." "You assume?" He threw an angry look at her, his voice mocking. "You know he was the first person who went to retrieve all the materials from the testing control center. He even got into a serious confrontation with our security officers. How could you still trust him?" Her mouth dropped open in shock and disbelief, and then she snapped it closed. It could be true, she thought. Maybe that's why Igor left without saying goodbye or telling her where he was going. She felt ashamed at her own simple trust and naivete. Major Leo pulled a notebook from his desk drawer and held it out. "Tell me, why did you want to give this notebook to him?" "It's his." "But it's full of notes about the testing control center. That's our project. It belongs to us." She looked at him in astonishment, unable to follow his twisted logic or find any words to rebut the ridiculous assertion. She sat there in silence, staring at him. "Comrade Meng, it is quite painful to see how far you have deviated from our principles. You were blinded by your lust and utterly fooled by him. You have abandoned basic vigilance, even going so far as trying to meet him again and give him such an important book. How much damage would it have done to us? Have you thought about that?" She shook her head. She couldn't believe an ordinary notebook was her latest stumbling block. Finally, she found her voice. "The Russians are already so advanced, well ahead of us in nuclear technology. Why would they need to steal information from us? I only wanted to see him because we were friends." Major Leo narrowed his eyes. He knew what she meant by friends, and the thought enraged him. Zoe stared back at him, terrified at the sudden fury in his eyes. Abruptly, he stood up and began pacing, like a wild beast in a cage, and then suddenly shouted, "How dare you!" She flinched as if struck, not understanding what he meant. Her eyes followed his steps, left and right, back and forth, in the cramped space. She was so scared that she stood up, wanting to run away from him, a fuming monster. "How dare you choose him? What good is there in a Russian revisionist? He is a liar and a spy. You have betrayed our country. You have made us lose face. This is a disgrace." He spun around and loomed over her, so close that Zoe shrank back against the wall. His eyes bulged out with blazing aggression, and the muscles of his face were taut and distorted. His powerful hands gripped her arms, nearly crushing her tiny body. His foul breath hit her face as he pulled her toward him. She felt his filthy mouth against her cheek. "Comrade Meng, I always liked you. You should be mine. Only I can protect you." Before she could grasp what was happening, Major Leo shoved his tongue in her mouth. Her head thrashed against the intrusion, and she felt vomit rising in her throat. But he easily overpowered her pitiful efforts. His vice-like grip bent her backward until she thought she'd snap in two. Her head hit the wall as he forced his face against her, his rough, hard lips smothering the breath out of her. He pulled his mouth away, long enough to hiss in her ear. "Fuck you! You're mine now." Grabbing her hair, he dragged her to the bed and flung her down. He towered over her, almost crushing her as he ripped at her clothes. The more she flailed, the more violent he became. "No, please, no," she begged, straining to keep him from between her legs. He ignored her pleas, a mixture of lust and fury gleaming in his eyes. He yanked her trousers down. Reflexively, she jerked her knee up and hit him in the stomach. He slapped her hard and swore, "You stinking whore! You dare fight me?" Dazed, she tasted blood. Her head was spinning, caught between terror and revulsion. Under his clumsy, sweaty body, she closed her eyes and went limp. beaten in body, mind and spirit. Major Leo grunted again and climaxed with a shuddering spasm, his fingernails tearing at her skin. He lay on her, breathing hard for several seconds before heaving himself off the bed. Zoe lay paralyzed, blinded by tears and shaking uncontrollably. Major Leo pulled his trousers up and smoothed his uniform. Without looking at Zoe, he went to the desk and lit a cigarette, and then walked to the window, looking out over the vast desert as he smoked. "I don't know why you're crying. You're no virgin." He turned to look at her with disdain. "Now get up and get dressed." Hiccuping back her sobs, Zoe found her trousers and vainly tried to wipe his mess off her with the sheet. Several buttons were missing from her blouse, and she fumbled with the remaining ones. He sat at the desk, picking up her self-criticism, and skimmed it again. He looked bored, though irritated with her weeping, and rattled the paper in her direction. "Some areas could be more thorough, but overall, you've written well. I think, at this stage, you don't need to write another one." He looked at her, expecting to see gratitude. Instead, her swollen eyes blazed with swift hatred. "I despise you," she spat at him. He laughed, a bark of amusement at her defiance. "Kuzinji can't help you, but I can. Think about that," he said coldly, and gestured toward the door. "You can go now." Her only thought was to get away from this monster. Though her knees shook and her feet dragged so she could barely move, she forced herself to take one step, and then another, and another. The room seemed to swing around her, and she put her hand out to steady herself against the wall, determined not to fall. Searing pain tore through her body, but she kept going. Once clear of his office, she staggered out of the building and kept walking. She had no idea where she was going. She only knew she wanted to be as far away from the general's tower as possible. In spite of her desire to do the right thing, in spite of her determination and drive, in spite of everything, her life was a shambles, and had been for far too long. An overwhelming sense of loss and failure drove her forwards, unaware of anything but the desire to die. She should have stayed in America. She should never have come here. She should have died before Major Leo could rape her. She could never face her parents again. It was her own choice to come here. Death was the only way to release herself from this agony. The midday sun had burned away the morning clouds and rain. She stumbled on, dizzy, thirsty, and in pain, until her foot caught on a rock and she fell. Too weak to stand, she crawled toward a small, stunted tree and leaned against it, closing her eyes and imagining what death would be like. She felt no fear, only relief. The Tibetan celestial burial would be good, she thought. If she had walked for kilometers, died where no one could find her, and was eaten by the birds, there'd be nothing left for anyone to accuse. After a while, she opened her eyes and looked around. The desert was quiet and still, with not even a fly buzzing around her. She roused herself to stand, drawing the last remnants of energy to gather a few rocks and pile them under the tree. Breathing hard, she climbed on the rocks, took off her belt, and looped it around the lowest branch. As she stretched up on her toes to slide the loop over her head, she lost her balance and fell, striking her head on a rock. The last thing she saw was the belt dangling overhead against the pale blue sky. Zoe awoke, confused and disorientated. This wasn't her dormitory room. A glass bottle hung next to her, with a tube dripping fluid into her arm. Through the haze, she realized she was in a hospital. Then a face next to her bed came into focus, snapping her back to reality, tense with loathing. Major Leo stared at her, a bowl in one hand. She longed to get up, to smack his face, to push him away and run screaming from the room. But she was too weak to move a finger. All she could do was turn her head aside when he tried to feed her a spoonful of rice porridge. He patted her shoulder, ignoring how she recoiled from his touch. "Comrade Meng, true revolutionists never commit suicide. You must be strong. I hope you will get better soon." His voice was calm and serious, almost caring, with none of the harshness she'd heard before. He put the bowl on the bedside table and stood up, sliding his fingers down her arm. "You must eat and get better. This is an order. I will visit you again tomorrow." As his crisp, military steps faded away, the room descended into a silence so deep that she could hear the fluid dripping into her arm. Her brain was as defenseless as her body, leaving her bitter, regretful, angry, and despairing. She stared around the room. At least here, nobody could come and force her to attend the building site. For that, she was glad. She did not want to see anyone. Her fingers probed at the heavy bandage on her head. The sudden sharp pain reminded her of her failed suicide attempt. She closed her eyes, succumbing to the emotional and physical exhaustion, and slept. Hours later, she awoke, clear-headed now, and forced herself to consider what lay ahead. Her first burning desire was to report her rape to Commissar Chu. Major Leo should not get away with the crime he had committed. But then she reconsidered. Why would Commissar Chu listen to her, a weak, bourgeois woman already under suspicion as a spy and traitor? Commissar Chu would only count her accusation as a feeble attempt to discredit Major Leo. Just one more black mark on her record. Of course, nobody else would believe her. She didn't trust anyone. There was no possible way she could explain to anyone how she had been mistreated. Her only option was to endure whatever physical and mental hardships were waiting for her back at the site. Death would have been welcome, if not for her parents. They had worked hard to bring her up, and in turn she had an obligation to look after them as they aged. The stain Major Leo had put on her would only break their hearts. What's more, if she died, she would lose any chance to clear her name, and the crime of suicide to escape punishment would be added to the indictment against her. He had said it. A true revolutionary would never commit suicide. She would be branded an anti-revolutionary, a traitor, and her parents would have to live with the shame of her disgrace. The thought brought her to tears as she wept both for her parents and for herself. She heaved a sigh, feeling as old and fragile as a vase seamed with cracks, alone and unloved, and poised to break at the slightest touch.